I think most people would agree that England's rise up the International Education League tables over the past decade or so has been a welcome sign of progress. But when government funding is now in such short supply, and is likely to remain so for some time yet, sustaining this recent progress may become increasingly challenging. A new report from IPPR and Ambition Institute, written by Loic Menzies and Marie Hamer, argues that the way in which we support and invest in the teaching workforce through continuing professional development, or CPD, may be the key to unlocking higher education standards in future. So what does this new report want to change in terms of how we invest in teachers and leaders? How easy would it be to convince schools to spend more time and money on CPD? And could improving the quality and quantity of training go some way to convincing more people to stay in the teaching profession? My guests are Avnee Morjaria, Associate Director for Public Services at IPPR, and Loic Menzies, an Associate Fellow at IPPR and co-author of this new report. I'm Tom Richmond, and to hear more about how we could reform the way that we train teachers and leaders in schools, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Over the past year or so, the Labour government has set up several new initiatives in an effort to improve standards in schools. We've got the new schools bill going through Parliament. We've got the ongoing curriculum and assessment review. We've got new regional improvement for standards and excellence team to support underperforming schools. So there's plenty happening in the schools landscape to improve standards. Avnee, with your new report, what's the argument that you made for why CPD available to teachers and leaders also deserves to be part of this conversation when there's so much activity going on elsewhere already?
Thanks, Tom. To start with, I'd like to talk about the educational context and the wider context that schools are working within. Over the last decade, we've seen improved educational attainment, but we've also seen, after a period of the attainment gap closing, it widening again. We've also seen post-pandemic a complexity of need from pupils that we've never seen before. And we have got a recruitment and retention crisis in schools where schools can't get enough teachers to teach their classes, let alone improve the quality of that teaching. And all of that is couched within a pressure on public finances. And so within this very difficult environment that we need to see a move on the dial or a change within the system to improve the situation for young people, particularly those that are most disadvantaged. And I think within this context, structures and accountability can only take you so far. They can raise floor standards so that we have schools all operating at a standard level, but they do create perverse incentives. They also are most suitable in a low trust, low skill environment, and they are definitely not suitable for addressing the complexity of need that we have in the system at the moment. And so the only real way of moving the dial on the system is then to kind of invest in the workforce. And that is something that can make the shift to a high skill, high trust environment. And we know that great teaching is the best lever for improving student attainment. So investing in the workforce will also improve student attainment, but that is disproportionately true for disadvantaged students. And we also know that teachers can improve. And so this is something that we can change. Teaching is a learned skill and an evidence-based practice. And so investment in the workforce using evidence-based practice is something that can have a real impact on the system, both in terms of student attainment, but also in terms of the way that teachers are feeling about the job, the level of self-esteem that they have, the investment that they have in their own practice, and all of those kind of things not only address the student attainment issue, but also keep teachers in the system, helping them to thrive, keep teachers teaching.
Okay, so it's certainly not the case that all these other initiatives are not going to have any effect, but it's more that teacher CPD can be a really nice complement, I suppose, to these other things that are happening and might play a different role within that when it comes to raising standards. So if we then look at the existing CPD landscape, I think someone new to this area might see all sorts of things that look quite encouraging. They will see what we call the golden thread of 3 programs. That's initial teacher training for getting people into teaching, the Early Career Framework, or ECF, to support recently qualified teachers, and National Professional Qualifications, or NPQs, for existing teachers and leaders. And those NPQs are already in the process of being rewritten. So there's lots happening within the teacher CPD landscape already. And yet this new report still calls for some quite big changes. Loic, what exactly is the problem that needs solving here? What is it that this golden thread of initial teacher training, the ECF for new teachers, and NPQs for experienced teachers and leaders, what is it not delivering or not delivering enough of in your view?
So I think you're completely right to highlight the fact that we've come such a long way on this, that there is so much good that's going on. Even if you trace back to 1998, when it was the previous Labour government that introduced these entitlements to ensure that early career teachers got time off timetable, got proper training and so on. And we've been on a long journey since that with the introduction of the golden thread, as you say. And we're seeing that starting to pay some real dividends. There's some emerging evidence that early career teachers are leaving the profession less than they might have done. So it's starting to pay off. And we're really starting to see this much more evidence-informed profession and a raising of the game when it comes to the discussions that happen about professional development and about professional expertise. But ultimately, we're still behind where we need to be. You know, we've got 250,000 teachers who've not yet accessed any element of the golden thread. If you look at international comparative statistics, you can see that in England, teachers access half as much CPD each year as they do on average across the OECD. And latest teacher tap data suggests that 1 in 5 teachers feel that they can't access the PD they need. So to me, it seems quite clear that we're not adequately supporting our teachers to take on these huge challenges that Avnee set out, despite the fact that teachers have worked so hard to step up to those challenges. And ultimately, if we want to have this new lever that we envisage in this report for system improvement, where PD has the power to sort of unleash this cycle of improvement and development by empowering teachers to work more effectively, then we can't have these massive gaps. And those gaps sit there across the system. So we know that, you know, we've got this expanded offer to early career teachers, so in the first year or two of their teaching careers. And then we have the NPQs for teachers who are looking to move into leadership. But what happens in between? You know, there's a long way between those things. And we have teachers who want to develop an aspect of their classroom expertise. And on top of that, we have leaders who've been in leadership for a while, but who are desperate to increase their skills in areas like early years provision or special educational needs. And there's just not the kind of quality assured, evidence-based training available for them that is commensurate with the challenges we're asking them to take up. So that's why this report calls for this universal access to an expanded and reformed golden thread that gives people this passport that can take them through the profession and ensure they all have that core backbone of expertise that can allow them to take on those challenges. Because it's right that we're expecting teachers to do their very best to take on these challenges, but the support needs to be there in place that's commensurate with those challenges.
Okay, so ultimately you want an expanded offer of CPD and you want to make sure that access to that is improved as well. So let's discuss some of the proposals that you've put forward in this new report. You have essentially proposed a 3-pronged approach to developing the teaching workforce. First, there's the golden thread of programs. Second, there should be what you called system priority programs, so that the government can invest in particular priorities, such as, say, special needs. And third, there is the professional development overseen by schools and school trusts. Now, this last point around school-based CPD really caught my eye because I've never met a single teacher who does not have some horror story about some training session or course they attended either at their school or elsewhere, which they thought was pointless, they thought was a waste of their time, and it really didn't add any value to their career. Loic, let's say that the government does its job and designs even better and more rigorous qualifications as part of the golden thread. But as your report noted, most CPD is designed and delivered in-house by school leaders. So how much of a difference can a new, expanded and improved golden thread make if we're not really sure whether all the other training offered in schools and trusts has been created by people with the right skills and expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, I've been a teacher and I've experienced those moments when you feel you've got so much else you could be doing, which would have so much more impact because what you're getting is not high enough quality. And that is one of the problems we want to tackle through this report. There's a lack of access. There's a system that's not joined up. There's too much provision that's not high quality. And teachers just don't have the bandwidth to engage with stuff that's not having an impact. So what we've tried to design here is a real system, because at the moment, the system is not a system. We believe that the role that government can play, yes, is in terms of making sure everyone's got access to that golden thread, but that only being that fundamental backbone is so there is all that other stuff that goes on. And government can't and shouldn't control every aspect of that. We know that teachers want a degree of autonomy. Schools want to be able to shape their provision around the challenges they're facing and so on. So government shouldn't try and control everything. But what it can do is curate a system. So what we tried to talk about in this report is about how government should go about curating the system to build an ecosystem in which the provision of CPD that's out there is of better quality. And the way to do that, we think, is for it to be constantly investing in the best quality provision as part of the golden thread and through system priorities, so that you start to have growth of high quality stuff that's been quality assured. So that means that you've got more available that is of a higher quality. And we call that the kind of ratcheting up of quality. Secondly, we think that in order to improve the quality of PD, you need to make sure that there's enough expertise in PD itself. So knowledge about PD, what makes good PD? Have you experienced good PD? Can you recognize it when you see it? We need leaders who are informed and able to make those choices, and teachers who've experienced it. So if teachers are experiencing really good quality provision as part of the NPQ and ECF, then they will be better placed to recognise the good stuff that's out there and to know what they should be looking for. But we also believe that there should be much more train the trainer training available that can start to build that amount of expertise. And so there's lots of steps that the government can take to make sure that schools and teachers are more informed consumers, picking from a much better supply that's out there. And finally, we talk about a kind of system architecture that will support this. And it's about ensuring that we're capturing knowledge about good teaching and disseminating that. And we've seen great progress on that through the EEF, the work of a chartered college and so on. So these institutions in our education system are starting to capture some of the knowledge about what makes great teaching, what makes great PD and so on. And those institutions can hold up and support this much improved ecosystem, which we think would mean that schools are choosing provision that makes a difference and that really can contribute to that improvement in outcomes.
Avnee, what's been your experience as a teacher and leader of in-house CPD? Do you think we should be optimistic about the direction of travel, or do you think it still might be quite a big hill to climb when it comes to getting that in-house CPD right?
I think that government has got a role to play in ensuring that the right ecosystem exists for teachers and leaders to draw upon in order to get the kind of in-house CPD right. I have both delivered and sat through varying qualities of CPD. And as a leader of schools, I've often kind of reached out into the ether to find that I haven't got the support that I need or the development that I need to deliver great CPD within my own school or across networks. So there is a role for government, but there is a balance and a trade-off in ensuring that that is driven by the sector, that the sector has a voice. And again, government has a role in ensuring that there are the institutions in place to harness that voice, harness that expertise, and ensure that we've got standards across schools and that we're sharing the great practice that exists in many, many different pockets across the country.
Okay, so it sounds like you're both fairly confident we can make progress on the quality of CPD. But that brings me on to my next question, which is something that Loic has already mentioned around the quantity of CPD, because your report has some fascinating stats on this issue. In Singapore, teachers have a right to 100 hours of CPD a year. And across the OECD, as Loic mentioned, teachers participate in an average of 62 hours of CPD a year. In England, teachers report getting about 20 to 30 hours of professional development. Your report wants to aim for 60 hours a year of CPD for teachers in England, which sounds like a big leap forward in many respects. But my immediate thought was, how would this fit into conversations around staff workload? Across a 39-week teaching year, say, that would be an extra 1 hour a week of professional development for every teacher. Now, I'm not suggesting that wouldn't be a good thing in terms of improving the teaching workforce, but I wonder how realistic a goal that would be in practice. Avnee, do you think that teachers and leaders would warm to the idea of 1 hour a week of extra CPD, or could it end up being seen as a burden?
So I think teachers generally really enjoy activity that shows them how to make an impact. And so I think that there's an absolute link between the quality of the CPD that they're receiving and whether or not they'll see it as a burden. And in some cases, the CPD that they'll receive will not only help them to make more of an impact, but also show them how to do things more efficiently for their students and within their school. But I don't think that fully addresses the question around workload. And I think that's an important and separate question around schools' capacity and their resource. And whilst the two things need to be taken side by side, it doesn't mean that we should dismiss or diminish the need for the CPD because teachers don't have the time. We need to make the time for teachers to get the CPD that they need. It's the only way of taking the school system and school standards to the next level and unleashing that really important cycle of improvement that Loic mentioned.
Loic, how would you want to deliver your aspirations around almost doubling, I suppose, the amount of time devoted to CPD? Is this something you'd expect schools and trust to support you with?
So I think there's several aspects. I mean, Avnee was right there, I think, to emphasise that there needs to be some greater bandwidth. We need to be making sure that teachers are freed up and that we tackle the recruitment and retention crisis such that teachers aren't having to fill the time off timetable with extra supply teaching and so on. We need to make sure there is that capacity in place, and that's something we acknowledge in the report. But the report shouldn't be covering everything. But I think for me, what was really important here is that point Avnee made about that kind of nurturing point of how nourishing it can be to participate in this kind of activity. I was out in a rural primary school just yesterday talking to the leaders there. They're in an area that's designated an opportunity area by the government, which means it's in a very challenging context. And they were to their school that's really made a massive commitment to PD. And the leaders there, I asked them this question about how they fit it with workload. And they were just saying this is the thing that teachers value them so much in their job. It's the thing they find the most nourishing. And that particularly the type of network-based local provision that we envisage as part of that second prong of the entitlement we described, there is that more local and informal form of support. It's relational between different schools. It's contextually informed. And I think that's the kind of thing that makes teachers feel more supported and more able to take on the challenges they do day to day. So I think we shouldn't see this as something that pulls against workload. It's something that helps teachers to take on the challenges they face. But we do also acknowledge in the report that there are schools that will need additional capacity grants to make sure they're able to participate in this. So this is something we envisage that government will need to invest in. And we think that should be targeted at the schools that are in the areas facing the greatest challenges. Because really, we should be making sure that wherever teachers are teaching, the support that's available to them is commensurate with the challenges they're facing in their context.
Okay, so let's say we get the quality of CPD right based on the proposals in your report, and we get some of those quantity issues sorted in terms of capacity and resource as well. The next thing which I was really interested in probing was this question of success, because in my previous podcast episode on flexible working in schools, we had a really interesting discussion of what success looks like and how easily you could quantify and measure the success in the context of more flexible working for teachers. So I'm wondering how these new proposals for improving teachers' CPD would grapple with the same question. How will you know if better CPD is working? Is it something to do with recruitment and retention data, or is it something else entirely? Loic, what does success look like with something as broad and varied as teacher CPD?
So, as you mentioned, we believe that PD needs to be much more coherent. So there needs to be a coherence around our priorities for the system. And one of those priorities is certainly recruitment and retention. So we should see professional development as a tool in making the profession more attractive. But we should also be seeing it as a lever for improvement in priority areas for the system, which include things like special needs provision, early years provision, and so on. So we think that the sector should be working with government to identify system priorities. And we think that unions have a role to play in that Chartered College has a role to play in that, in setting those priorities. And we would then expect to see PD as a lever for improving in those areas. When it comes to measuring that impact, we think that you need to have an approach to measurement and monitoring that is adapted to the type of provision that you're talking about. So if you're talking about golden thread professional development, it makes sense that be very tightly quality assured, because you're talking about very large investments of public money and you're talking about delivery at a very high scale. So it makes sense for that PD to be closely monitored and evaluated, and Ofsted is best placed to do that at the moment. When you're talking about much more informal, local and school-based provision, it doesn't make sense to have the same level of kind of potentially quite onerous oversight. And therefore, that needs to be much more light touch. What I'd like to see is school leaders being able to explain their approach to professional development as part of inspections. And we've seen that in the past as part of a leadership and management judgment in the Ofsted framework. And so I'm really keen that Ofsted continue to have those kind of professional conversations with school leaders about how they're deploying professional development as a tool for school improvement. And that, to me, seems like the appropriate level at which to be monitoring the impact that professional development is having on school improvement.
Avnee, what do you make of this question of capturing the impact of more and better CPD? We can obviously rely on things like the number of hours that people do, but I guess that feels a little bit inadequate if we're looking at the quality as well. What do you make of how we can try and think about this issue?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing to consider within this question is, what does success look like? And I think that you can look at that from various lenses. The first one you might think about is, what does success look like for teachers? And I think a coherent journey throughout their careers where they feel like they're developing the skills that they need to apply in the classroom and beyond feels like a successful and coherent experience for teachers. How might you know whether that's the case? Well, I'm a big fan of asking teachers what they think of their own experiences. And so I guess one of the things that would be really important to me is over time thinking about teachers' experiences of CPD and what they say about those experiences and whether those experiences are improving, particularly around the coherence and the journey through your career point. There are kind of other harder metrics in terms of measurement. So you could think about student attainment over time, but those kind of reforms take time to show themselves in kind of national data. And so that's something to understand, is that there are long-term metrics that you might be able to use to show general improvement. And I think that that's also the case for recruitment and retention over the medium term, that you should see particularly retention improve. And you can look at that at different points in a teacher's career, where we've had more teachers stay on through the kind of ECF process. How does that translate into kind of medium-term teachers, longer-term teachers? What does that mean for teachers entering the profession versus teachers that are already in the profession? So there are those kind of metrics or measures to think about. And then there is the plain old access point that you mentioned, Tom. And then I suppose finally there's this kind of hot potato around Ofsted and whether Ofsted are the right people to be judging whether or not the quality of professional development is improving. And I think in an environment where Ofsted is one of the big drivers of teacher and leader behaviour, you can't have a system where Ofsted doesn't take an evaluative role in what's happening, because otherwise, as we know, teachers, leaders, schools prioritise the things that Ofsted are looking at. If I was designing the system from scratch, Tom, would that be my opinion? Perhaps not, because I think like the kind of the environment that we're seeking to create is one of high trust, high skill, and that can be supported by inspection and regulators, but it isn't created by them.
Well, just to pick up on this point, Avnee, around Ofsted, I think you've been an Ofsted inspector yourself and joined an inspection team, so you know this better than I do. What we've talked in this episode quite a bit around expertise. So is there not a question around whether Ofsted would have the expertise, particularly if, CPD offers in the past weren't very good when many Ofsted inspectors were perhaps being trained and training themselves? Can we expect an organisation like Ofsted to really be able to pick out what makes for great CPD, bearing in mind all the changes we've seen in recent years?
Yeah, and I think, this is a question asked about every aspect of any framework is, do the inspectors on the ground have the expertise to understand whether that element is effective? One of the things that I really appreciated when I was an Ofsted inspector is the training that we had around evaluating the impact of, whatever the school policies were, and thinking through not only whether we thought that the provision was of high quality, but then looking at how it felt on the ground to the stakeholders that were there. And I think that is something that Ofsted inspectors can and would do well. Whether they'd be able to look at using first principles at kind of CPD program and evaluate the quality of it. I just don't think that's not the whole job. You need to take the thing and understand what it's doing and then make an evaluation of whether it does that well. And yes, I do think that that's something that an inspectorate can and would do well.
And I think that it's really not about expecting Ofsted to go into schools and make a judgment about the quality of CPD that's on offer. It's much more about when considering leadership and management and the school's approach to school improvement. It's saying, okay, is there systematic planning taking place about how you help your teachers develop expertise? Is the school thinking about where its strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of its teachers' expertise and responding to that by being an informed consumer who's going out there and finding provision that matches those needs? So I think it's a different kind of judgment that we're asking for there.
Okay, thank you. We are approaching the end of this episode, so it's time for one last question from me. I think your report makes a strong argument for trying to build on existing good practice with teacher CPD, but also hopefully making that provision even better in future and more widely available. But inevitably, expanding and improving professional development courses comes with a price tag. You talked in the report around 40,000 extra NPQ places a year. You talked about 110,000 new short courses of CPD as well, all of which came to £260 million over the rest of this Parliament. So my question is, if the government said to you that you couldn't have all of that 260 million, but maybe you could have half of that or say a third of that amount, what would you tell government to prioritise for investment from the list of proposals that you have in this new report? Loic, what are the most important changes that you think need to be prioritised?
So I think the first thing to say is that it's important to remember that Labour's pledge in its election manifesto was that it would invest 270 million. And what we're proposing here is 260 million. So I think we're already there being very generous in offering quite a useful saving there. And we're also talking about, through this system priority approach, we're talking about how to bring together existing funding streams and to use them in a much more coherent and systematically planned way. So I think what we're trying to do is not only to develop this system that is empowering, but also to help the DfE and the Treasury to manage these very tricky times we're in by finding some ways of delivering PD more effectively and more efficiently with higher impact. So, but throughout that, I think the core priority has got to be making sure we've got this expanded and reformed golden thread that is fully funded and that is available to all teachers throughout the country, so that we have that core baseline of knowledge and expertise throughout the profession. And I think Ambition Institute and IPPR are really clear that is a powerful foundation that's been laid that really needs to be done on a long-term basis, because I think the key thing here is the fact that the profession needs to understand what its entitlement is and what it can expect to see in the future. So whatever investment there is needs to be rolled into the DfE's core budgets, rather than this constant fear from the sector that something might only last another year, this kind of constant bit by bit drip feeding of mini pots of money. We need something that is systematic and that becomes more efficient as a result. And finally, I'd say that we should always be looking at this through the lens of equity and social justice, and recognising there are these greater challenges faced by schools in challenging circumstances, and that the support needs to match that. And therefore, prioritisation should always involve making sure that the teachers who are working in these really challenging environments have got the best possible support. So those schools need to be prioritised, whatever tough decisions are made.
Thank you, Loic. Avnee, if you had to settle for less than you hoped for from a financial perspective, what would you tell government to prioritise regarding the next phase of teacher CPD?
Yeah, and so I would stress what Loic has said earlier, which is this in the scheme of things, in terms of education spending, is an entirely modest ask. We've been really kind of aware of the financial pressures that are on government, the financial pressures that are on schools, as we've kind of put together the recommendations within this report. And also, to stress that the kind of level of investment in CPD and professional development and workforce development is something that will pay dividends in kind of short, medium and the long term. It can cause a foundational shift in the quality of provision for our children within the system. If I really had to prioritise, my thoughts are that we need to be thinking about the children and the schools that are in most need. Teachers across the country teach in extremely different circumstances. And I know this from personal experiences. Working in the most deprived schools, working in the most deprived areas is extremely challenging. And those same areas find it hard to recruit and retain teachers. And so funneling funding or tilting funding to those areas rather than thinking about which policy area in particular would be my call.
Thank you, Avnee. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Loic and Avnee for talking us through their analysis of how we train teachers and leaders in our schools and how we could potentially train them better in future. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.